Good afternoon and welcome to NCIA's Industry Essentials Educational Webinar Series, our premier digital educational platform featuring a variety of interactive programs to provide you timely, engaging, and essential education when and where your team needs it most. My name is Brian Gilbert, the Deputy Director of Events here at NCIA. And as always, I'm very excited to welcome you all to the first of a multi-part series of our Committee Insights program today, being presented by NCIA's Cannabis Manufacturing Committee. Before we get started, a thank you and final note to our guests who are joining us for the preview on our Facebook live stream. If you're an active NCIA member, follow the short link in our description to log into your account and join the conversation. If you're not an NCIA member, follow the Join Now link to activate your membership or the Register Now link to purchase a discounted pass so you don't miss out on this invaluable programming today. Now, let's get this show on the road. We all know vaping product regulations are coming, so in today's program, we'll hear from members of NCIA's Cannabis Manufacturing Committee to learn what to expect, hear what manufacturers can do to support compliance, and most importantly, help protect the environment and public health. I know our audience is eager to dive into today's program and our panel is ready to get the conversation started, so let's not waste any more time. To kick things off, I'd like to welcome our moderator for today's session, Emily Long, the Senior Project Manager at Byers Scientific, to the virtual stage to introduce our panel of esteemed experts. Thanks for joining us today, Emily. You can kick things off from here.
Hi, Brian. Thank you. And thank you to everybody that is registered and participating in today's webinar. Thank you as well to the panelists and especially to Mr. Robert Thomas, who is our guest speaker today, and he will also be presenting first. He is with Scientific Solutions and has many, many decades of experience with heavy metal testing, so he will be covering topics regarding that in cannabis. We have next Ramon Alarcon. He has a decade of experience in the ECIG industry, which is very useful for applying to some of the cannabis kind of standards and regulations that we'll be talking about today. And then we also have Arnaud Dumas de Rauly, CEO of Blinc Group and chairman of ISO standards on vaping products. We'll also be discussing some potency regulations today with Ramon. So I am Emily Long. I'm, as Brian said, with Byers Scientific, Senior Project Manager. I'm also the chair of this future-proofing subcommittee of the Cannabis Manufacturing Committee, which is putting together this future-proofing your business series. And this is the first webinar of the series for 2021. So look forward, more to come as far as blog posts, podcasts, and webinars discussing processes, manufacturing processes, manufacturing facility regulations, and also obviously extracts and vaping emissions, which we're talking about today. So with that, I introduce Robert Thomas, our first speaker today, and he is going to present to you on heavy metal testing.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Nice to be here. Thank you for the invite. Very much appreciated. I'm now going to share my screen and going to be talking to you about heavy metals. Okay, please bear with me. I'm there in a minute. Okay, so first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Robert Thomas, and I run my own consulting company that focuses on the educational needs of the cannabis testing community. For the past 2 years, I've been researching and writing a book on measuring heavy metal contaminants in cannabis and hemp. So I'm going to kick off the session today with a talk on heavy metals regulations, which is featured in my new book. So let me dive right in and give you an overview of my talk. I'd like to kick off with the current status of heavy metal regulations for cannabis and hemp, particularly the limitations of a fractured state-based system. I'll then focus on how the pharmaceutical and dietary supplement industries approach regulating elemental impurities and how they abandoned the 100-year-old semi-quantitative colorimetric test and replace it with a modern instrumental technique. I'll also offer my perspective on what the cannabis and hemp industry can learn from this process and give my thoughts on how the industry should move forward with federal oversight around the corner. So where is cannabis legal in the US today? Here's a map of the US with light green representing states where medicinal cannabis is legal and dark green where both recreational and medicinal is legal. It is legal for medicinal use in 36 states, with 14 of them also allowing for recreational use. However, many of the other states are going through the legalization process, so this map could look very different in 12 months. Most of the 36 states have heavy metal limits. Majority of states just specify the big four heavy metals: lead, cadmium, arsenic, and mercury. Maryland adds chromium, selenium, silver, and barium, while New York includes nickel, chromium, antimony, zinc, and copper. Oregon has no heavy metal limits at all. Let's take a more detailed look at some of the individual states. This is a table of heavy metal maximum limits for 7 different states: California, Colorado, Oregon, Maryland, New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, compared to the United States Pharmacopeail Chapter 232 permitted daily exposure limits, often called PDE limits, for elemental impurities in drug products, together with USP Chapter 2232 PDE limits for dietary supplements, and the American Herbal Pharmacopeail limits for heavy metals in botanicals and herbal products. A couple of points to emphasize. USP Chapter 232 defines a total of 24 elemental impurities based on the drug delivery method, which is oral, parenteral, or inhalation, while Chapter 2232 only defines the big four heavy metals in dietary supplements. So in this table, 12 of those elements have been included to reflect the big four, plus the additional elements in Maryland and New York. It's also important to emphasize that Chapter 232 limits in this table are based on microgram per day. So to know what's allowable in the actual drug or supplement, these limits must be recalculated based on the suggested daily dose for that particular drug or supplement. For example, if the maximum dosage is 10 grams per day, these limits must be divided by 10 to convert to microgram per gram in the drug. Let's take a closer look at 3 of these states, which emphasizes the fractured nature of these state-based regulations. Let's begin with California. California was the first state to regulate cannabis in 1986, and as a result, it is considered the gold standard with regard to cannabis regulations. California limits are defined in microgram per gram in 2 different categories: inhalation cannabis products and all other cannabis products. So these are the same as USP Chapter 232 PDE limits for inhaled and oral drugs respectively, based on 10 grams of consumption per day. It's also worth pointing out that even though pharmaceutical PDEs are based on a suggested dosage of 10 grams per day, we really have no way of knowing in what quantities people consume cannabis products. Here are the limits for Colorado, which are a little more complex to explain. Colorado limits are categorized by heavy metals of interest in the first column, acceptable limits in the second column, and products to be tested in the third column. The acceptable limits are defined in part per million in the product and not microgram per gram. Besides inhaled and oral, they also include limits for transdermal products via the skin. The limits for inhaled products are based on USP Chapter 232 PDE limits for inhalation drugs, but the limits for oral products are based on USP Chapter 2232 for dietary supplements. However, the topical values are based on FDA limits for heavy metals in cosmetics. Note, these values are based on acceptable limits for 1 gram of intended use and not 10 gram as in California. Here are the limits for Connecticut. They are defined a little differently because they are based on microgram of heavy metal contaminant per kilogram of user body weight per day. So it's very difficult to get a good understanding what this means with regard to maximum daily consumption, because it's only based on body weight of the consumer. However, in toxicology studies, very often a typical body weight of 60 to 70 kilogram is used, but you still need to know what is the recommended consumption per day of cannabis product to make the calculation of the heavy metal maximum allowable limit. Let's talk more about the PDEs defined in USP Chapter 232. Here is the full list of USP Chapter 232 PDE limits, which are based on maximum limits in microgram per day for 24 elemental impurities in the drug compound per delivery method. So for a suggested maximum daily doses of 10 gram, these limits should be divided by 10. Also note that Chapter 232 limits are the same as the ones defined in ICH Q3D guidelines for elemental impurities. For those of you who are not familiar with the ICH, it is the International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use, which is a consortium representing the global pharmaceutical industry, including the United States, European, and Japanese pharmacopeairs. Here are the USP Chapter 2232 PD limits, which are for dietary supplements only. It should be emphasized that this chapter also addresses different forms of arsenic and mercury because of the potential of different arsenic species in plant-based botanical supplements, as well as the potential of methyl mercury in fish oil or kelp-based products as a result of the conversion of elemental mercury to methyl mercury by many fish and aquatic species by the process of bioaccumulation and biomagnification. At this point, I'd like to give you a little background to the United States Pharmacopeail because I think it's important. USP is an independent non-profit organization which is not part of the US government. However, it works very closely with government agencies, ministries, and regulatory authorities around the world. The mission of the USP is to improve the health of people through public standards to ensure the quality, safety, and purity of medicines, dietary supplements, and foods. USP standards have ensured consistency for drug products throughout the world for 200 years and are recognized in more than 130 countries. These standards, known as United States Pharmacopeail National Formulary, or USP-NF for short, is a book of public standards for drug substances, dosage forms, compounded preparations, excipients, medical devices, and dietary supplements. The FDA designates the USP-NF as the official compendium for drugs sold and marketed in the US, which must conform to these standards to avoid possible charges of adulteration and misbranding. So what is the USP process to change a standard method or a specification? USP continually revises standards through a unique public-private collaborative process which involves scientists and industry, academia, and government, as well as other interested parties. The American Chemical Society was one of the interested parties who worked with USP to update these new methods. I lead the Heavy Metals Task Force on the American Chemical Society Reagent Chemicals Committee. The test for heavy metals was described in USP Chapter 231, which was first introduced in 1908, which is very similar to our ACS test. The test relies on precipitation of the metal sulfide in a sample and compares the color intensity to a lead standard. USP felt that it was time to replace Chapter 231 with methodology that reflected modern test methods and updated toxicology data. So let me briefly explain how Chapter 231 works. It is based on a sulfide precipitation of the analyte elements using an organosulfur compound and assumes that all analyte heavy metals behave in a similar manner to a lead standard, which samples are compared to. It is semi-quantitative in nature. At best, that was initially intended to detect a small group of heavy metals, but there was no clear definition of which elements it was detecting. It is well recognized to have many limitations, so it's pretty amazing that it has survived over 100 years. So what are the limitations? This slide shows the colored sulfide precipitates of 12 different heavy metals. Imagine if all 12 elements are present in a sample, how difficult it would be to compare the color of the lead standard, which is circled in red. Some of the other limitations include it cannot detect individual heavy metals. Typically 5 ppm is the limit of detection. It's very labor intensive. The interpretation of the color varies with the experience of the analyst, and it needs a large sample size of approximately 5 grams to work properly. So let's look at the timeline to change this method. It began in 1995, where a USP Pharmacopeail forum identified issues with Chapter 231. Then in 2000, an article in the Journal of Pharmaceutical and Biomedical Analysis proposed inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, otherwise known as ICP-MS, as an instrumental alternative. In 2004, an article in the same journal showed major recovery issues with USP Chapter 231 compared to ICP-MS. However, it took approximately 12 years for various expert committees, expert panels, working groups, and stakeholder meetings to implement these proposed changes. Yeah, USP definitely works extremely slowly. In January 2018, all 3 USP chapters and ICH Q3D guidelines were finally approved and adopted. So how did USP and ICH propose the design and scope of the implementation of these new PDE limits? They decided it was important to have a chapter specifically for pharmaceuticals only. They called this chapter 232. They wanted to separate dietary supplements from pharmaceuticals since they are regulated differently in the US and other regions around the globe. They called this chapter 2232. They wanted to simplify the harmonization process between USP and ICH by separating chapter 232, chapter 2232 limits from the analytical procedure which they described in chapter 233, which focuses on the plasma spectrochemistry technique, ICP-OES or ICP-MS, the microwave digestion procedure, and a full list of validation protocols. Let's talk more about the classification of elemental impurities in pharmaceuticals. This is a slide of PDEs defined in chapter 232 in microgram per day for the 3 different drug delivery systems, oral, parenteral, and inhalation. But this time I'd like to emphasize the first column, which is the class of elemental impurity. Class 1 elements, these include the classic heavy metals, lead, arsenic, cadmium, mercury, which are human toxicants and have no use in the manufacture of pharmaceuticals. These should be evaluated at all times. Chapter 2A elements have a high probability of occurrence in the drug product and also should be evaluated at all times. Class 2B elements have a reduced probability of occurrence related to the low abundance and as a result can be excluded unless they are intentionally added during the manufacture of the drug product. And finally, class 3 have relatively low toxicities by the oral route of administration, but could warrant consideration for inhalation and intravenous routes. So what elemental impurities could end up in the drug product? They identified 4 potential sources. The first one, elements intentionally added in the formulation of the drug substances. Examples of these include platinum group metal catalysts, which are often used in the organic synthesis of many drugs. Elements that are not intentionally added and are potentially present in the preparation of the drug product. Examples of this might include talcum powder, which is used primarily for tablet compression. Talc is basically magnesium silicate that is mined from the earth, so it could potentially contain high levels of certain heavy metals. Thirdly, elements that are potentially introduced in the drug substance from the manufacturing equipment itself. Examples of this include the leaching out of chromium, nickel, and iron from stainless steel mixing or storage vessels. And finally, elements that have potential to be leached into the drug product from the plastic storage containers or closure systems. The bottom line was that regulators require the pharmaceutical industry to have a comprehensive understanding of all elemental impurities in its drug products. So with this as background information, let's now take a closer look at sources of heavy metals in cannabis from my experience over the past couple of years. There are basically 3 major potential sources of elemental contaminants derived from the growing of cannabis and the production of cannabinoid products. They are, the first one, from cultivation sources. First point to emphasize is that cannabis and hemp, when grown outdoors, are known as hyperaccumulators of contaminants in the soil and have been used as phytoremediators to clean up heavy metals and radionuclides from toxic waste sites. So if there are high levels of elemental contaminants in the soil, they will most likely end up in the plant. Other potential sources of heavy metal contaminants derived from the cultivation process include fertilizers, pesticides, water, nutrients, and growth enhancers. The second source is from process and manufacturing equipment, including extraction and purification procedures, cutting and blending equipment services, mixing containers, storage vessels, plus edible product recipe ingredients and tablet or capsule formulations. And finally, delivery sources, including devices such as vaping pens, inhalers, patches, and dropper bottles. So let's take a closer look at what elements could potentially be of concern in growing cannabis and the manufacture of cannabis products. First of all, it should be emphasized that if cannabis is grown indoors under more controlled conditions, the plant typically has lower levels of heavy metals. However, if it is grown outdoors, there are about 15 heavy metals found in natural ecosystems, and contamination from industrial activities such as mining, metal refineries, petrochemical plants, power plants, cement works, etc., that could potentially be sources of contaminants in the plant. Also, decades of using leaded paint and leaded gasoline has left its mark on the environment. The list of elements shown here are ones taken from evidence in the public domain of heavy metals being taken up at various levels by cannabis and hemp plants. Again, I emphasize that cannabis is a hyperaccumulator that has been used to clean up heavy metal contaminant in soil, including after the Chernobyl nuclear plant disaster in 1986. There is also the potential for the concentration of the elemental contaminants during the extraction and purification of the cannabinoids. If it's in the plant and the flowers, there is a very good chance it will end up to some degree in the extract. In addition, the manufacturing process could add to this list based on the metallic equipment used to grind, extract, and purify the cannabinoids, such as nickel, chromium, and iron from stainless steel containers. To emphasize this point, there have been multiple product recalls over the past 6 to 12 months for elevated levels of heavy metals. Let's take a look at a few of them. There was a case recently where a CBD oil producer from Florida was forced to recall a CBD tincture by the FDA because it had 10 times higher lead levels than the maximum allowable limit for Florida, 5 microgram per gram instead of 0.5 microgram per gram. 13 strains of medical marijuana sold at a licensed medical center in Michigan were recalled because they were contaminated with high levels of cadmium and arsenic. Medical cannabis regulators in Maryland issued an advisory to notify patients of potential lead contaminants of cannabis liquids in vape cartridges following exposure to heat inside the device. There have been many more examples reported in the public domain like this. So let me finish by summarizing my thoughts on future regulations for heavy metals in cannabis. The current list of 4 heavy metals, lead, cadmium, arsenic, and mercury, is clearly inadequate. However, the 24 elements required by the pharmaceutical industry would probably be an overkill. However, it is absolutely critical that the cannabis industry has a much better understanding about the many potential sources of heavy metals in its products, particularly from the growing media and or the soil conditions. I think that elemental contaminations derived from the cultivation and manufacturing process would warrant regulating at least an additional 12 elements. So a future federally regulated list of potential heavy metal contaminants in cannabis could include the big 4 plus the additional 8 elements required by Maryland and New York, plus an additional 4 based on elements in the public domain, making a total of 16 elements. A number of standards groups have listed other elemental contaminants in addition to the classic big 4 heavy metals in many of their methods. This slide shows a summary of 4 of the groups involved in writing methodologies for measuring heavy metals in cannabis. This is clearly telling the industry that at some point they need to be monitoring more than the big 4 to assume consumer safety. In particular, I'd like to draw your attention to the list of 13 toxic elements in the list Canna QAB program, which is developing certified reference materials for cannabis and hemp. And finally, more information on this topic can be found in a couple of white papers I've written on heavy metals. The first on cannabis and hemp was published in Analytical Cannabis online, and the second one on vaping aerosols is posted on my website, but it soon will be published by Analytical Cannabis. I thank you for your time, and I welcome any questions at the Q&A session at the end.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Robert. You can stop your screen share now. Yeah, perfect. Thanks. And I'll pick it back up from you. All right. All right, perfect. We're going to transition into the next segment of the program, and Ramon and Arnaud are going to join the conversation and lead us through another few slides on their side as well. So at your all's convenience, you can pick it up, and I'll take your all's verbal cues from here.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for inviting me here. Happy to be here, and I apologize. I'm in an unfamiliar location, and it just so happens that the sun comes in through the trees right at the wrong time. So hopefully that won't be too distracting, but thank you for having me today. What I thought we'd do is, first thank Robert for really that in-depth analysis of the elemental impurities, but then follow that with a discussion on maybe a little more open discussion on how you translate that into future-proofing your business. So Arnaud and I are going to, we have some slides here to share with you that will share some high-level principles, but really we want to have like an open discussion, and then we'll transition into the Q&A where hopefully we can continue this discussion. So maybe before I go on, I'll ask Arnaud to introduce himself as well and say hi, and we'll get going.
Right. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Arnaud Dumas de Rauly, CEO of the Blinc Group and chairman of ISO and European Standards Commissions on vaping products. Ramon, thanks for the intro. And I think one of the main things that we can really dive into right now is specifically being prepared for emissions testing. We've seen over the past year that states like Colorado have signed emissions testing into law, and I've always been discussing this with everyone in the industry. Why are we testing the oil in these products when that oil goes through a state change and becomes aerosol? People call it vapor. Technically, it is not vapor, but for the purposes of this presentation, we can say vapor or aerosol. Because in essence, that's what consumers are putting in their lungs. That's what we should be testing. And a lot of the times, I can tell you from seeing the data, the products and the byproducts and degradants of the entire aerosol process are completely different in the aerosol than they are in the oil.
Yeah, that's a great point. As a matter of fact, if you can advance the slide, we can dive into that a little bit. So this is exactly what Arnaud is talking about, is that's what goes into your body. And I think about it as three legs of a stool, right? You can have a perfect cartridge, a great battery, the oil can be really high quality and clean, but yet in combination, under certain circumstances, certain usage parameters, you can generate unwanted emissions. And I think one of the things that you as the audience as cannabis product manufacturers need to start to wrap your heads around is that in order to really characterize your emission, to really truly know, it needs to be tested as a system. And that I know that's a complicated thing to do, right? If you're manufacturing oil or you're manufacturing cartridges, you don't necessarily have complete control over what battery is going to be used with it and how that's going to be used and what settings will be used. That is a potential issue in the future if we have to be able to prove that our emissions aren't providing unwanted contaminants. And one idea we have to present for your consideration is, while it may be impractical right now to do that, certainly if you have a closed system, you can do that. But if you are in the business of manufacturing open systems, so cartridges that can be used with other batteries, we think a good first step would be to at least do testing with some batteries and settings that you can then recommend to your customers. So at least you've made that first attempt to say, yes, we've looked at it, and at least under these parameters, we're confident that we're providing a safe experience for the user.
Yeah, and Ramon, as you were clearly stating, it's not only about the cartridge. When we're talking about testing as a system, we need to keep in mind that what the consumer, what the patient is buying is a product. The product is not only this, not only the top part, not only the bottom part, it's the combination of both. As you said, we can have the best oil and we can have the best hardware. If the combination of both doesn't work together, it's going to give a bad product and a potentially toxic product that people are going to be inhaling as well. A lot of the entire process of vaporization and generating aerosols involves fluid mechanics, chemistry, and thermodynamics. Imagine putting all of those aspects of science into one in this little tiny vaporizing device. It's really a complicated scientific process. And I'll give you a very simple example. Just the battery, the power of your battery can potentially burn some of that extract and turn into toxic substances. So the idea of using recommendations specifically on the packaging or at the point of sale is very, very important. Ramon, remember back in the good old nicotine vaping days, I think you and I can be considered dinosaurs in this industry. When you look at those big box mods that provide 60-watt power, if you use that with cannabis, I mean, it's horrible, the stuff that's going to be coming out of the emissions. It's really dangerous. So a lot of what needs to be done on the emissions testing is education.
Yeah.
And the methods for measuring, I mean, we're going to be speaking about how this is measured just after this, but they are known, they are clear, they exist. Standards do exist.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue. Why don't we go on to the next slide? And this is what he's talking about. And again, our intent wasn't to get into the nitty-gritty details, but just to provide conceptual overview. But you can see on the right-hand side 2 images of how vapor is typically collected. This example applies not just to cannabis, but this actually comes from what's required for PMTA submissions to the FDA in the ECIG industry. So both particulate and gas phase contaminants are analyzed using these sort of setups. And the reason we want to share it with you is not that you'll necessarily need to replicate this in your own labs, but by having a familiarity with how these tests are conducted, you'll be able to better understand how they, the methods. And when you analyze, when you get a report back from a lab, for example, you'll understand how it was done a little bit better. But it is also possible to replicate this in your lab. So if you really want to go for future proofing and you have a budget, not that big of a budget, but you can invest in a smoking machine. There are a lot of commercially available ones, and these setups aren't all that expensive. So one of the things you can look into as a cannabis manufacturer, if you want to get ahead of this, is to think about how you might replicate this, at least on a development level, so that you could pre-test some of your products before sending them off to a lab of the future that will be set up for cannabis emissions testing.
And if anyone is really interested in understanding how these machines work, there is an ISO standard for a routine analytical vaping machine. That is ISO 20768. 20768 is the standard for a routine analytical vaping machine. So in your selection, if you speak to any vaping machine manufacturers, you can ask for that compliance. There's also, I mean, in this entire process of making sure that the emissions are safe, one of the most important things is the vaping profiles and the vaping regimes. As you can see with these diagrams, the vapor device is used, and how long is that pull? How long are you gonna let the delay be between pulls? I think we have a method that has been used in nicotine vaping called CRM 81, which is a 55 milliliter pull of vapor for 3 seconds every 30 seconds until the device is empty. We all know as cannabis industry stakeholders and as cannabis consumers that no one is ever going to be using products that way. So our goal is to really develop a standard vaping regime or a standard vaping profile that we can use for testing, whether it's in state, federal, in Canada, anywhere in the world. Where there's ongoing work about this. Today, a survey has just been launched. It's a peer-reviewed third-party piece of research on understanding self-reported data from recreational users and from medical users. And I hope this is going to be the first step into doing more topography data down the road and in building awareness that these products are not used the same way as cigarettes or as nicotine vaping products. We need to have a cannabis vaping regime. We have the survey link here, blinc.nyc/survey. The survey will be valid for the next couple of weeks. We have a separate third-party validated amount of people who are going to be doing this test as well. But this is more of a great, of a general public survey as well. So the more data we get, the more we'll be able to create those standard vaping profiles.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so that's actually a way to start with future proofing is, look, we know there are going to be regulations, but you can help inform those regulations with the right profiles by participating in this study. And then we also have some additional information. Seems like not so long ago, but maybe it was about a year ago, the NCIA published a Safe Vaping Task Force white paper that contains some additional information on this subject. If you really want to dig into it in a little more detail, we encourage you to go to the NCIA's website and look for that and download it. Can we have the next slide?
I'd also just like to add specifically to that slide and to the previous points that the nicotine vaping industry in the US was shot down in large part because of the industry itself, because the industry was not pushing forward on research, on getting these things done. Let's not replicate this as the cannabis industry, because we want our industry to thrive in a couple of years and not be brought down by the same issues we had with nicotine vaping.
Yeah, good point. And then this next slide, this just gives you a little sense of when you do this sort of collection that was shown on the prior slide, what you get. And I know there are a lot of numbers here, so we're not going to drill into it all. But this is an example from the e-cig world, from my days when I worked at Blue, where we were comparing cigarettes, which are the first three roads, the Marlboro and 2 L&B products, against a number of Blue products, and then interestingly, air blanks. So just background air. You can see here there are groupings of different sorts of contaminants that are measurable. And some of the clear ones, carbonyls, for example, which include formaldehyde, acetylene, all the things in the footnotes below, you can see we're multiple orders of magnitude lower for these products. But it's not to promote or actually these products I think are now outdated, but the point is that this is the output of that sort of analysis, and this is actually what you're inhaling, and this is what the when we're testing the cannabis regulations, we don't think will look the same, but these are the general nature of things that we think will be looked for, because they show up in aerosols from vapor products and combustion products. Some of them, like I said, will be common. Others, there will be unique ones for the cannabis industry.
And I think this, going into the continuum of risk, I was going to do the intro to that slide.
Yeah.
Following this, we have what we call, in at least harm reduction for tobacco, something called the continuum of risk. And we have different types of products for those different risk profiles. One thing to keep in mind is that any kind of research that is done on these products should always be compared to something. If we look at nicotine products, for instance, they need to be compared to smoking, because nicotine products are for smokers. It's the same thing with cannabis and vaping products. These products are for patients. These products are for the end user. So if we compare them to not putting anything in your lungs, of course it'll be safer. That said, we have done some research in the past, and we've proven that walking around in a city, I'm French, so I'll take an example of Paris. Walking around in the city in Paris for 1 hour, you'll be inhaling more toxic substances from that than from vaping for 1 hour. So there are really some very good research pieces out there to prove the harm reduction side of vaping and extracts.
Yeah, and actually, my own interesting anecdote. There's another study I'm aware of where we actually compare the blue products to a room to simulate a dining room. I think 10 tables, each of them had a little candle. So 10 candles, 10 tables, measured the air in the room, and then replicated that with 10 people smoking or vaping on our e-cigs. And the amount of formaldehyde and similar contaminants in the air was I think it was 2 orders of magnitude lower with the vaping. So just to give you a context that the world around us, whether it's the streets of Paris or a restaurant where everyone's got a candle on the table, it's the background is not zero. So why are we telling you this, and how's this relevant to future proofing? Well, because the regulations aren't formed right now, one of the things you can do is A, understand these principles, but also B, and this goes to the last bullet point here on this slide, which is a lot of regulators don't understand this. And to the extent that when you are involved in talking with regulators, that they understand these things, that we're not competing against some hypothetical zero. What we're trying to do is get the products with the least amount of harm. And so in that way, by providing this counterbalancing argument to regulators, you're trying to build that sensible future regulatory environment under which you'll be manufacturing your cannabis products. So I think that's good on, so we've talked a lot about emissions, right? And we know there are going to be emission standards, more coming down the road, and they'll include those things. But then the last bit we want to touch on, a little bit of time we have remaining, is potency regulations. And the message is be ready for them, right? And we view them as a double-edged sword, right? In that there are some regulatory bodies that are looking to lower the potency, and that is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, look, if someone needs a certain amount of THC for whatever their end goal is, treating maybe their back pain or whatever they're trying to do, they're going to self-titrate. They're going to take the amount of THC they need in order to deal with that back pain, right? So these potency regulations really aren't necessarily terribly effective in that regard. And to the extent that there are any degradants in the vapor stream, well, guess what? You've got to take more puffs, so you're probably taking in more of that as well. So that's one of the downsides. But we also view it as an opportunity, right? In that we know that there will be some that go through in terms of the potency regulations, but there's certainly no harm in broadening a product portfolio that we think can attract more customers, more mass market customers. And we use this example here is like, why compete on THC content or whatever the content may be? Like the clear, one example is very high potency alcohol. Well, that tends to be low price and low volume, whereas these mass markets exist with very low potency products, but you can consume them all day long, enjoy them at a backyard barbecue, tailgate, or you can have really high-end products like this Chateau Lafite here. So, I wouldn't view potential potency regulations as completely negative. I would say to future-proof your business, the best thing you could do is to think about how you develop low potency products that are attractive to the consumer. And the final point I'll leave you with on this is that does mean you may need to add other excipients in order to do this, right? If you can't have pure THC oil because it will be too high in potency. So we have to have ingredients And I myself am a proponent of things like VG and PG if they can be controlled in your product. If you think back to those emissions that we shared with you in those slides, those numbers were all exceedingly low, and those products all had VG and PG. But the difference is the hardware was very well controlled so that VG and PG did not degrade, didn't decompose into potentially harmful constituents. So hopefully that gives you another thought to start, noodling on, and how you might prepare yourself for this type of vapor regulation. And I don't know if you want, Arnaud, if you have anything to add to that on our way out and before we open to Q&A.
Well, I think the last point really on potency and on the excipients is a lot of people and a lot of regulators actually banned PG and VG. Those are probably the only two products in inhalation that we have so much data on. We have at least 15 years of the nicotine vaping industry. I've been in the industry since 2009. That's 12 years, at least. We have all of that data, and we know the toxicology by heart of PG and VG, yet some regulators are still banning it. On the other hand, products like MCT, we do not have the data. So maybe have a moratorium on these products. There's still a lot of things that we need to do. I think the underlying theme of everything we just talked about is work on research. The entire industry needs to get up to speed and do the research that is necessary. And when I mean the research, we're not only leaving this to researchers. Every industry member should have an R&D program and contributing to, I would say, the greater good in terms of the cannabis industry.
Yeah, thank you. And I actually, that's actually a segue. I was peeking off screen to a different screen at one of the questions, which was about terpenes in vapor products. So I don't know if this is a good time to segue into the Q&A. I'm getting the thumbs up here. The answer to
the question was really well in line with the program at the moment, so it's a great transition. Go for it.
So to Arnaud's point on the in the Pharmacopeail, there are excipients that are known for inhalation, ingestion, topical, and included in those are VG and PG, and what's not are many terpenes. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're necessarily bad, but we do know that some of them at certain amounts present risk, can be toxic at certain levels. So if you're talking about adding terpenes well in excess of what's normally found in the cannabis plant or concentrating it up to excessive amounts, there's potential harm there. And then also the thermal degradation of many of these terpenes is, my understanding, again, I'm an engineer, not a chemist, but some of the terpenes maybe are potentially more susceptible to thermal degradation than others, and then can generate some nasty byproducts. But again, I'm not a chemist, so that principle applies. But maybe Arnaud, if anyone else has something to add to that, I invite you to do so.
No, I think the terpenes, as you said, it really depends on the concentration of the terpenes that you're adding. But there's often one thing that's neglected is what is the carrier oil that is used in those terpenes. Sometimes the terpenes are mixed with PG, VG, MCT, and we're saying we're banning MCT, but we're saying this terpene is myrcene, for instance, but what's the carrier oil in that terpene is MCT. So sometimes you got to be careful of how you're doing this, and you really have to do your due diligence on the products that you're putting in there. I mean, I could tell you right now, and this is internal testing, hasn't been third-party validated or anything, but we've done some tests specifically with myrcene. Above 7% myrcene in some products proves that there are some VOCs that come out of the emissions, and some toxic products. So it's really important to know what you're doing, what you're putting in there. Do your due diligence and don't hesitate to do testing. What I hate seeing in this industry is people who are like, well, if we test and it's bad, that means we'll have the bad product and we won't be able to say, no, we didn't know. Well, so what? We're talking about people's healths. I think it's really important that we get up to speed with this. And thank you, Carrie, for the comment. I reiterate that I'm also part of D37, ASTM D37, and there are a lot of issues that we need to find out. That said, high temperature, agreed, but we got to look at the temperatures that these products are going to, for especially extracts versus dry herb, is often a very big mistake that's made.
One thing I will know is do be careful. For those of you who do want to jump in with both feet, we had some products where we thought the device itself was fairly well temperature controlled, but our emissions analysis was done with a headspace method where the temperature was actually very high. So yeah, we actually found it was actually the analytical method produced some byproducts that we weren't expecting. So you can, I guess the takeaway message is, you really have to look at your testing, your methodology, as well as your products, because this is a developing field.
Yeah, thank you. And I think Erica is wondering on any insights on why VG and PG have been banned. Honestly, misconceptions, and a lot of the issue also stems from the fact that the cannabis industry does not want to be associated to the nicotine vaping industry, and there's a lot of talk going on and saying, hey, look, nicotine vaping is demonized, it's dangerous, there's PG, so I'm just lumping PG in there, which is completely untrue. Ramon just showed through the data on the presentation that the harm reduction aspect of nicotine vaping is huge. So it's really, really important to understand why this happened and have a plan and have research to back it, because when we go see regulators, when we go see politicians to explain all of this, if we don't have supporting data, it's totally useless. So we really need, as an industry, to get our stuff together and provide this data. I do have, if I may, I have a question for Robert on the presentation. Robert, you said there were 3 stages in contamination. So there's the cultivation sources, there's the processing sources, and then there's the device sources.
Yeah.
In your opinion, in terms of percentages out of an entire batch, for instance, what are those levels of contamination between the cultivation, the processing, and the devices?
You mean a breakdown of each of those 3 areas?
Yeah, kind of understand. Yeah, which is the most probable out of those 3, and which is the least probable, for instance?
Well, it's a great question. I'm not too sure I know the answer, but I can give you my opinion based on a couple of years of research in my book. There's no question that cultivation is the biggest source of heavy metal contaminants. I mean, there's no question about that. Plants that are grown in soil which is contaminated. I mean, it might not be grossly contaminated. It might be maybe a field that was used to grow tobacco, but we've seen in the public domain that fields that have been used to grow tobacco do contain quite high levels of some heavy metals. So I would say you don't need to plant your cannabis or hemp in a grossly contaminated field. If it's in there, the plant will pick it up. There's no question about that. I don't have a good feeling for the processing side because I can't get information from the process about heavy metals and how, whether they trace them through the processing, purification, filtration, winterize. I mean, it's a complex process to go from the flower to an extract. And it's very difficult to get good data from processors because they will not share it with me. They would, in fact, it was often difficult to get processors to respond to my phone calls and my email communications. I'm not suggesting that they're doing some bad stuff, but I don't think they know. And then if you then go to the packaging side, there's definitely contamination coming from the packaging, from rolls. I mean, paper rolls. We know there's heavy metals in roll. We know there's heavy metals in dropper bottles. We know there's heavy metals in some patches. It's the production of devices which are used to deliver the products to the consumer. You're talking about stuff which is not clean, which is not high purity stuff, because obviously you use high purity stuff and that impacts the cost. And the industry at this present moment in time is not using high purity equipment. And you and I have discussed this with vaping systems. I mean, the metal or all the components that are used in the majority of vaping systems on the market have some kind of elements or some kinds of metal associated with, whether it's the metals themselves, whether it's the O-rings, whether it's the ceramics. These materials are notorious for containing high levels of not only heavy metals, but transition metals, which when vaped at high temperature, and you're talking about a pH of an oil or an extract or whatever the cocktail is, pH of around 4, that's acidic in nature. And over time, whatever's there, you'll corrode it. So I don't think I've answered your question, but based on my experience over the past couple of years, I would say definitely the cultivation area is the most contaminated. I don't know about the processing area because I have not seen data, and there's nothing in the public domain. But there's definitely stuff coming out on obviously vaping devices and delivery systems, and it's just not clean enough.
Oh, great. Well, thank you for that. There's another question from Darwin on, in our opinions, is the industry doing enough product testing before releasing new forms on the market? But personally, I totally think not at all. I mean, it takes 12 years to put a drug on the market. It takes 3 years to put a regular medical device on the market. It takes the cannabis industry 2 days to put a product on the market. Because of not doing enough research and not doing enough quality control specifically on some of these products.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say I'm not being overcritical on the vaping marketplace, but I don't think a lot of research has gone into the optimum components. I think that they've been made based on nicotine vaping devices, and there's stuff being used which is pretty obvious. You use brass or use stainless steel, and you keep a vaping cocktail in there for up to 3 months. Even if you don't vape, over 3 months, that will attack or corrode some component in that device. And my personal opinion is the market has to go to higher purity components. You different metals even. Don't use brass. Brass is notorious for corroding, and they use lead in brass. I mean, lead is used to machine brass. Stainless steel that you would think would be corrosion resistant, it's not. You need to be thinking of something like high purity alloys that are used in the aeronautical industry. Titanium, cobalt. I mean, there are alloys out there which are very corrosion resistant. Obviously, it's going to increase the cost of a vaping device, but I think you guys should be looking, even though you can't have, metal-free components, there are plenty of really high purity plastics out there, polymers, which you could use in conjunction with really, high purity metals like titanium. I think that's the way you should be going.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just quick response to Erica about more terpenes and the trends about adding melatonin, valerian, or other botanicals. Are they safe in vapor? I think the main answer here is going to be the same answer. We need to do research. There is no inhalation categories. I'm going to give you a very simple example. You know, there are a lot of these vitamin C pens or vaping products out there. Well, guess what? Your lungs are not able to break down the vitamin C. So does it make sense? I don't know. There's certainly no benefits, but there might be some downsides. So adding melatonin, valerian, I've heard people adding taurine or caffeine. It makes no sense because your lungs are not equipped to break it down like your stomach is or like your skin is. So it's really going to be something that we need to watch out for as an industry. Not to mention that it's adding products like this to nicotine vaping products that killed the nicotine vaping industry here in the U.S.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to future-proof, or one of the best way to future-proof your business is don't do stupid stuff like that. You know, stick close to the plant until we have the research. Or as we've talked about, VG and PG have long profiles of usage, or long histories. So just to wrap up on the future-proofing concept is we need to be innovative, but probably the worst thing we can do for our future is to, you know, if we deviate far from the plant, we have an idea for a new product, it may be a great idea, but the best thing you can do, the responsibility then transfers more to you to really test and really understand what the full toxicological profile of that is. So that's kind of how I'd leave it with you.
Fantastic. Well, I don't think that we could leave the program on any better key takeaways, unless any of the other panelists or Emily have some final remarks that they wanted to leave the audience members with. We'll transition into the outro.
Yeah, let me
Sorry, Robert.
Go on. No, go on.
I just wanted to thank you, Robert, and Ramon and Arnaud for being panelists today. That was really sound insight that you offered for the audience, and some great questions that came in. So thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it. We will be doing a follow-up podcast on these topics and kind of answering some of the questions on a more broad scale in a podcast recording that should come out mid-March. So look for that to come out in the next couple weeks.
Fantastic. Well, Robert, did you have some?
Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to emphasize that that the white paper I have posted on my website, which will soon be published in Analytical Cannabis, is directly focused on the new Colorado regulations for characterizing vaping aerosols. And it's just a white paper on all the issues, all the complexities of trying to quantify elemental contaminants in vaping aerosols, particularly as the metals exist in the particulate form. Some are ionic, some are actually dissolved, but the majority of them are in particulate form. So that requires a whole new measurement, sort of regimen to be able to quantitate particulates when you're both using a hydrophilic and a hydrophobic liquid. It's not straightforward. So a lot of thought has to go into how these devices are going to be tested.
If I may just add something to what Robert was saying. Robert has authored a book called Measuring Heavy Metal Contaminants in Cannabis and Hemp. I went through the entire book. There's some things that are way too technical for me to get, but if anyone on this webinar is interested in learning a lot more, it's a wealth of information. Robert has an amazing amount of knowledge in heavy metals, and he's sharing it with the industry. He's giving the industry a roadmap. Now it's up to us to see if we want to take that information and do something with it for the future of our industry.
Perfect. Well, yeah, that's a perfect segue into.
Thank you. I couldn't have said it better myself, Arnaud.
Perfect. Well, that's a perfect segue into the contact info slide that we're showcasing right now as well. So please do make use of the emails that you see here and the website information that you see listed here as well. We also have social handles for some of the businesses listed as well. So make sure to stay up to date on everything that each of these amazing panelist businesses are engaged in at the moment. You You can learn more about Robert's book on his website. Make sure to head to the URL that we posted from Arnaud about that survey. I think he told us it takes less than 10 minutes. So make sure to get a survey response in and disseminate that as far and as wide as you all can amongst your networks over the next few weeks while he's soliciting responses for that. And then additionally, like Emily made mention of, do stay on the lookout for a follow-up conversation on today's program to be hosted on our cannabis industry or the cannabis the Cannabis Industry Voice. Yeah, sorry, I forgot what the podcast was named for a split second. The Cannabis Industry Voice, which is hosted on anywhere that you get your podcast, as well as promoted heavily on NCIA's website. We have a dedicated page for that, along with all the other 200 or so recordings from the last year or two that the podcast has been going on. All right. With that, we're going to transition into the outro of the program. So please do stick around for the next few minutes while we give you all an update and a preview of some upcoming Industry Essentials programs that we have scheduled on the calendar. And then you can use this opportunity to also directly engage with the panelists through direct messages or inside of the chat room over the next few moments as well. So big virtual round of applause and thank you once again to our amazing panelists for presenting today's program. You all can deactivate your video feeds and leave the virtual stage, and then continue to have those side conversations with the audience members in the chat room over the next few moments.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Perfect. All right. Next up, actually taking place tomorrow, we have our monthly members only fireside chat with NCIA's government relations team. For all of you all that aren't aware, the fireside chat series of NCIA's Industry Essentials webinar are an exclusive monthly opportunity for NCIA members to hear from our government relations team and guests about the latest developments in federal policy live. During tomorrow's webinar entitled Movement on Interstate Commerce, you'll learn about interstate commerce, but also about the history behind it as we delve into the implementation of the Commerce Clause. We'll also look at alcohol's past, discuss the U.S. both pre and post 18th Amendment, and look at the precedents for interstate commerce compacts. All right. So like I just made mention of, this is a members only session. So you have to be an active NCIA member to gain access to this program. You'll need to just sign into your account and secure a free pass inside of our membership management system, similar to how you did so for today's program. And then additionally, do take note that we have upwards of $75 in free tickets available to all active NCIA members for our upcoming programs taking place underneath the Industry Essentials webinar umbrella over the next month and a half. You can head to NCIA's website, www.thecannabisindustry.org/events, to see all of those upcoming sessions, learn if they are member exclusive or not, and then secure your discounted and or complimentary passes to attend all of those sessions. And with that, thank you all so much for participating in another NCIA Industry Essentials educational webinar. As always, a huge thank you once again to our panelists, our audience members, and most importantly, our member businesses, which make NCIA's work possible each and every day. You'll be directed to an attendee survey after leaving the meeting room. Please do complete that to gain immediate access to our presentation files. And do note that NCIA members receive exclusive 30-day access to a formatted video recording that'll be sent directly to your email inbox first. I hope you all have a wonderful week. I look forward to seeing as many of you all as possible, hopefully tomorrow, for our next Industry Essentials webinar. And as always, we'll leave you all with this end of event credit sequence highlighting the 25+ member businesses that participated in this afternoon's session. And while doing so, we'll showcase some audio stylings by the resident musician at our Colorado-based events, KJ Liss, and his Illinois-based musical side project, Indigo Sun. Enjoy, and we'll see you all later this week.